As a petition with millions of signatures now calls for a new general election, Keir Starmer has brought the country to the verge of nuclear war. With the UK and USA go-ahead to use powerful Storm Shadow missiles inside Russian territory, the UK has now crossed the line to be considered by Vladimir Putin a combatant in the war and a legitimate target of attack. Russia, in response, has launched ICBMs against Ukraine in a powerful show of force and talked about nuclear war. As the nuclear clock clicks down, Britain finds itself with the lowest army numbers for centuries. Meanwhile, the Trident missile system has repeatedly failed test firings, potentially leaving Britain completely open to nuclear attack. Yet how did we get to a situation where this was ever on the table? Ukraine, to many the birthplace of Russian identity, was part of the Russian Empire and was integrated both socially and economically into the USSR, overlapping in terms of both culture and language. In the 1950s, the territory of Crimea was transferred to Ukraine for administrative purposes. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Ukraine became an independent nation, but it was left divided, balkanized. The south and the east, culturally Russian, speaking the Russian language. The north and the west, culturally Ukrainian, more westward focused. The expansion of NATO and the EU worsened these divisions. NATO had promised not to move 1 inch east, but proceeded to invite many of the Soviet Union's old territories into their alliance. Meanwhile, the EU proceeded to admit many former Soviet member states. Ukraine was caught between East and West, particularly with regards to trade between the EU and Russian trading blocs. When Viktor Yanukovych was elected in 2010, with much pro-Russian support, he attempted to cut a fine line between the two, advancing the process of Ukraine joining the EU. However, as Ukraine moved into the Western sphere of influence, Russian trade sanctions caused severe economic shocks, given the level of integration between the two countries' economies. In response, Yanukovych decided to U-turn, opting for closer trade alignment with Russia, to much outrage. In late 2013 and early 2014, this came to a head with the pro-EU Euromaidan protests against Yanukovych. After an initially peaceful period, a violent government crackdown led to an escalation in violence from both sides. From the pro-government perspective, the protesters were violently attempting to overthrow the legitimate government of Ukraine, backed by foreign intelligence services and other organisations in essentially a foreign-backed coup. From the protesters' perspective, Yanukovych had attacked peaceful protesters and thus undermined his government's legitimacy. This collapse in legitimacy led to the collapse of the government, Yanukovych fleeing into exile, and a new pro-Western government installed within Ukraine. Russia moved swiftly to take control of the Crimea, a historically Russian territory where they had their naval base and their only warm water port. Meanwhile, separatists in the Donbass rose up in the Russian-speaking territories, arguing that the new government lacked legitimacy. From 2014 until 2022, civil war was waged in the Donbass region as Ukraine fell further into the Western sphere of influence. This is when we see Joe Biden bragging about having a Ukrainian prosecutor fired in order to provide aid money.
I remember going over convincing our team, or others too, convincing us that we should be providing for loan guarantees. And I went over for, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, no, I said, I'm not going to, or we're not going to give you the $1 billion. They said, you have no authority. You're not the president. The president said. I said, call him. I said, I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion. I said, you're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here. And I think it was, 6 hours? I said, I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money. Well, son of a bitch. Got fired. And they put in place someone who was solid.
Volodymyr Zelensky, a former actor and comedian who previously played the part of president on Ukrainian television, was elected in 2019 under a peace mandate. However, little progress was made towards this over the next few years. In 2022, Russia entered the civil war on the side of the separatists. Despite this, in early 2022, most terms of a peace deal were already agreed. However, Boris Johnson's intervention saw this deal collapse and fighting continue. This lends credence to the allegations that Ukraine is merely a Western puppet state. While neither country is entirely democratic, Zelensky has turned to banning his opposition and engaging in mass conscription, with millions fleeing the country in order to escape being drafted. Meanwhile, billions from the West pour in both military and financial aid, at the cost of the Western taxpayer. As the Ukrainians continue to lose, Putin has warned against Storm Shadow and other missiles used to target recognised Russian territory, which he considers a direct attack by the West on Russia, especially considering that the Ukrainians aren't capable of operating the weapons entirely themselves. The UK appears central, whether under Boris Johnson, Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer, to escalating this war. In early autumn, proposals to utilise Storm Shadow missiles on Russian territory were effectively vetoed by the Americans. However, following the victory of Donald Trump, this doctrine has changed. In early autumn, a proposal to use Storm Shadows in this way on Russian territory was rejected by the Americans. However, in the wake of Donald Trump's victory, who's promised peace, this doctrine has changed. This has brought both the UK and the USA to the brink of nuclear war with Russia before Trump is able to take office in January. The nuclear issue adds to a range of problems for Keir Starmer's deeply unpopular Labour government, bogged down in a tax raid on farmers, cutting the winter fuel allowance, and accusations of two-tier policing and justice. As the petition for a new general election continues to go, so there's the threat of nuclear war.